Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Alex Jaffe. I'm Director of Strategic Affairs for ASMEA. Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director, has a family situation, so he's been called away. Um, and we'd like to thank everybody for being here for the first ASMEA webinar of 2026. I guess that's what the year is. And we're very pleased to have very quickly put together the opportunity to hear from our friend Dr. Asher Lubotzky. And Asher is the Israel Institute Teaching Fellow and a scholar in residence in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston. He has a PhD in history from Indiana University, an MA from Bar Ilan, and he is one of the few specialists, I think, who looks at Israel-African relations, which is a very important and timely kind of issue. He's published widely in a variety of journals, including the ASMEA Journal, the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, as well as Israel Studies, Jewish Historical Studies, and in the popular press. And today we have the opportunity to hear from him about a very timely issue that is suddenly on everyone's radar, and that's the Israeli recognition of Somaliland, which came about only in the last week or two. So how we'd like to approach it, for those of you who've been with us before, what we usually do is Dr. Lubotzky will speak for 20 to 30 minutes. He has PowerPoint as well that we'll be looking at. After he's done, we'll take questions from the audience. Please enter your questions into the Q&A. There's a little box at the bottom of your screens, and you can type them in, and then we will have them read. Sometimes we combine them into one to speed things along. And if we don't get to your questions, please be in touch with us afterwards. We'll try and connect answers with questions as best we can. So with that in mind, thank you, Dr. Lubotzky, for being with us. I will be taken off screen and return later, and we look forward to hearing from you. So here we go.
Thanks for this introduction. Thank you for ASMEA for organizing this in a really quick manner. We just talked about the idea last week, so I'm really happy we got to do it. Okay, so let me share my slides. All right, so we had big news in Israel-Africa relations. A few days before 2025 was ending, and the news was that Israel recognized Somaliland. This was a huge move. It was a very bold move, very, some people say very untypical, maybe a new chapter in Israel's diplomatic history. And many people also didn't really know what Somaliland is or was or why is it important. And today in this 30 minutes that I have, and then another 30 minutes for some questions, we'll try to explore why this move is actually so dramatic, and it is, and why it's in a way also bold, and I think personally also a just move. Okay, it's a move out of justice, and not only about interests and struggles and geopolitical realities, but it's also something that there is a deeper bond here between those two nations, and we'll talk about this today. All right, so this is what we'll cover. We'll do a brief history of what Somaliland is in terms of their unique identity. I will really emphasize, I have about 10 minutes to talk about this, so I'll really emphasize the unique identities that was formed in Somaliland throughout the last century, and also explain how come they are embracing so warmly the Israeli connection, the Israeli recognition. So we'll talk about the history. We'll talk about why now specifically. Somaliland, as you'll see, already exists as a de facto independent state for 35 years. So why right now? We'll talk about the pros and cons of the recognition. Now we know, I wrote an article before analyzing what's going to be the pros and cons. Now we have already it happened, right? So now we have some lessons from real life. We'll talk about this and we'll ask very quickly if we think that America would follow or should follow suit after Israel and also recognize Somaliland. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So, all right. So really, this is the brief historical part. So bear with me. The Somali region, there is a region in the Horn of Africa, right? This is the Horn of Africa, looks like a horn. And the Somali speakers live around, as you see, in a very vast territory that today is comprised of several countries. Those states and borders started shaping in the colonial era. But before we go into the colonial era, which is a very important era, we need to understand also something about Somali speakers, or Somalis, if you want to call them. Somali speakers usually have a shared identity. All speak Somali. Or most of them are Sunni Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and they have a shared identity of being Somali. So there is a pretty strong identity, the Somali identity. But they also have a very important division among themselves, and the division is according to clans. Those are not tribes, don't say the word tribes, it's clans. Clans are family related. It's very, very big, extended families that spat their first kind of forefather a few centuries ago. Okay, so the Somalis, as a relatively big nation, are also divided into different clans. And this is very important. I'm saying this because Somaliland that you see is here in the northwest part of where Somalis live is pretty homogeneously, at least in this part, part of one clan called the Isak clan. Okay, so this is important. This is the first brick in the way that the Somaliland identity kind of started to form. There was a specific clan that found their territory right here. So this is one thing. It's not really ethnicity. It's definitely not tribal, but it is another layer of identity that besides being Somali, they also a part of the same clan. Um, okay, so this is one thing to understand about the Somali region. The other thing is that in the 19th century, as we know from the rest of Africa and essentially the rest of the world, colonial powers started taking territories and started creating borders and creating colonial states. And those borders and states were very arbitrary, very random. The lines were drawn pretty randomly or according to European considerations. Some kind of competition between different European empires, some kind of shady deals between European empires. Some of those lines were suspiciously very, direct, right, or clean. But it did not really take into consideration realities on the ground in Africa and other parts of the world. So what happened in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, this Somali region was divided into 5 different political entities. One entity was Somalia Italiana, and as you can tell, is a part here, the southern part of Somalia, that today we know as Somalia. Mogadishu is there, and it was under Italian rule. The other one was British Somaliland, which is the Somaliland that we are talking about today, okay, here in the north. The other one was French Somaliland, which is today Djibouti. And other parts of Somalis were left under Kenya, which was a British colony, or Ethiopia, which was an independent African state, essentially almost the only one that was left independent during this time. So Somalis are now starting to live under modern colonial nations, not nations, but states, right? With borders, flags, and so on, but not in the same state. Um, and trying to develop their own different identities accordingly. In Somaliland's case, they had the British experience. This was, you see the map here, British Somaliland was right here. The British cared about this area because, like the British, they cared a lot about areas that were on the way to India. Like the Suez Canal, like Aden, just across from Somaliland, Aden in Yemen, today's Yemen, like Cyprus, like Gibraltar, and like many other spots around the world that somehow connected the United Kingdom to India. And Somaliland was one of them, was one of the stops, the stations on the way. Somaliland happened to be a very strong at raising cattle. So it became kind of a very important place on the way, a station on the way to India that could feed both the colony of Aden and the maritime flotillas that went on to India, feed them in terms of selling cattle, right? Beef. So so that was Somaliland under the British time. Luckily for Somalilanders, the British were relatively, okay, they were still colonialists, right, still exploiting, but they were relatively nicer or relatively not so exploitative as the Italians next door. And it happens that British Somaliland relatively was during this time, the colonial time was developed more than the Italian neighbor. The Italian neighbor, they were more oppressed there, the regime was more centralized. In British Somaliland, the British allowed the people, the Somali speakers, to kind of run their own affairs, and that gave them more independence and also a sense of identities that the Italians, the Somali Italians, right, under Italian rule did not have. So this is another very important milestone. Another milestone was independence. In 1960, Africa was the world. Africa was were very optimistic. The colonial time is about to end. African states got independence one after the other. 1960 was the year, the Africa year, right? That dozens of African states got independence, and what happened then? That also Somaliland got independent from the British, and Somalia got their independence from the Italians. And they got independence, but they were very excited because it was first time after 80 years of colonial rule, first time independence in this kind of nation state, Somali kind of thing, and they decided to merge, to unite, to form a union. So Somaliland was independent June 26, 1960, and Somalia, the Italian Somalia, got independence on July 1st. On the same day that Somalia, the Italian Somalia, got independence, the British Somaliland, formerly British Somaliland, merged into it. So Somaliland was independent during this time for 4 days until it voluntarily gave up its independence and joined the other part of Somalia, southern Somalia. They regretted it very quickly afterwards. It wasn't even 1 year later that the formerly British Somalilanders understood that southern Somalia is there, the elites there, right, the rulers are there to exploit and marginalize the North. They are the North, right? They are British Somaliland. And they, since the early 60s, tried to leave this union unsuccessfully for 30 years. And their experience was pretty horrible under Somalia. They were marginalized, oppressed. At some point, they started the independence movement that became really big, a mass movement for independence for Somaliland. The rulers of Mogadishu, of Somalia, and especially the dictator, the infamous dictator, Siad Barre, this guy here, was very brutal in oppressing this independence movement of the Somalilanders. And the peak was in 1988, when Barre and his army committed what Somalilanders call as the Isak genocide. 200,000 people that were murdered brutally by the Somalis, by the authorities in Mogadishu. And it's called Isak because you remember, Isak is the clan that is the majority in Somaliland. So the idea here is that the other clans committed a genocide against us, the Isak, and we were the victims of it. And that became very big in their memory and identity and in the identity of the newly founded Somaliland that we'll talk about right now. So that was pretty bad. Now, just to mention a little irony of history, in 1964, when the African Union, before African, the Organization of African Unity, accepted a principle that was enshrining and respecting existing borders, Somalia was the one opposing it. It was the only country that didn't vote for this principle, because Somalia, remember, wanted to unite all of other Somali speakers that were not under its control at the time. So Somalia was actually the kind of revisionist state at the time. I'm saying it's an irony. I'm not thinking it's an irony because now, today, in the last few days, Somalia is going back to this principle of enshrining the borders, respecting the borders, to claim against recognition of Somaliland. But Somalia didn't even vote for this. But okay. Let's move forward with our historical background. And now Somaliland formed their own unique identity. So in 1991, they succeeded in pushing Mogadishu, Somalia, out of Somaliland and declared independence, or as they call it, re-independence, or redeclared their independence, because they always emphasize we were independent in 1960 for 4 days, but we're still very independent, and now we reclaim what was always ours, and we gave mistakenly away, and now we want it back. So in 1991, they declared independence. Somalia at the same time was torn in a civil war. Black Hawk Down, you know the movie, or maybe you know more personally even the stories, the American involvement there in the early 90s. Somalia is still officially in civil war, in an ongoing civil war. Somaliland, on the other hand, was relatively lucky because if you see again the map here, right, they are at the edge of the Somali region. So they geographically were successful to kind of separate themselves from all the violence happening in Somalia at the time. They never got recognition as an independent state. They remained a de facto independent until 2 weeks ago when Israel, right, was the first UN member to recognize them. They felt, and they're still feeling, even more so now, maybe, they felt betrayal. They felt betrayal by the Arab world and by the Muslim world, because Somalia is a member of the Arab League, right, and obviously a Muslim country. And they felt that when they wanted recognition for their own independence, most Arab states, officially all of them, right, chose to support Somalia instead. So if you see their discourse, right, how they talk about the Arab world and all this kind of like feeling of betrayal, they talk about Egypt, you guys supported the people who committed the genocide against us. Okay, so there's a lot of deep feelings there. And I'm saying that because I'm building kind of a narrative here to tell you and show you how Somalilanders really accepted warmly Israel's recognition and ties with Israel. All right, so since 91, we have a de facto independence. The state is stable, which is, again, we're in the Horn of Africa, one of the most unstable regions in the world. Somalia, definitely one of the most unstable states in the world, but Somaliland was very stable. At some point, they even formed democratic elections that ran pretty smoothly and pretty freely, and which is remarkable to the region. And they formed throughout the years ties, including very strong ties with many, I would call them pro-Western countries. Countries that were willing to have ties with them, not official, but have ties. There are ties with the United States, between Somaliland and the United States. There are ties with Great Britain. There are ties with the Emirates, very strong ties in the last few years with the Emirates. There are ties with Taiwan. The Taiwan also officially recognized Somaliland, but Taiwan is itself not a recognized state. Um, so they formed a de facto state. They have money, their own money. They have their own military, which is pretty efficient. They have elections, as I said. They have all those things that a state. They have a territory. The core of the territory is stable. It's true that on the edges of the territory there are some separatists that want to go back to Somalia, but it's only on the periphery. Most of the country is pretty stable, homogeneous, and the sovereignty of Somaliland, the Republic of Somaliland, is very strong there. So this is always a contrast to what was happening and still happening in Somalia, that experienced the opposite: fragmentation, prolonged civil war. Still today, the Mogadishu government, the government of Somalia, does not really control practically does not control most of its territory. It's in Somalia, if you're not aware, there's an organization called Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda affiliated organization, Al-Shabaab, that controls large swaths of the territory. In 2025, Israel recognizing Somaliland, and it offers a lot of hope and pride to Somalilanders. I don't know if you saw the videos in Israel. In Israel, people saw the videos and the photos a lot. It was widely covered. Also in Somaliland, people were out pouring into the streets with Somaliland flags, with Israel flags. A lot of love. Israelis that visited Somaliland in the last 2 weeks, there are already a few, all testified that they got extremely warm greetings and welcoming. So that was actually a very emotional time for, I think, both Israelis and Somalilanders. Um, and you see rhetorically and in practice that Somaliland is willing to pursue a very close strategic alliance with Israel. All right. So that was the historical part. I really tried to do it quickly. It's a pretty complex subject. And now let's talk about the why now. Why Israel now? So 'cause Somaliland has been practically, right, de facto independent for 35 years. Why now? Of all things. Um, so I mean, look at the map, and that's probably is going to solve your question if you ask this question, right? Somaliland, the Horn of Africa, right? It's right here. Yemen is right here. Houthis are in kind of North Yemen right here, 500 kilometers from Somaliland. What Israel understood in the last 2.5 years is that it has neglected and overlooked its southern frontier, its southern front, the Red Sea region. Red Sea, Israel also, if you're not so aware of the map, Israel, of course, is also touching the Red Sea, and then at the north part of the sea, and this is the south part. But Israel has been neglecting this region. This region was considered to be not strategic, not important, not threatening also, just, a periphery. And this thing really fired backlash at Israel in the last 2.5 years, when Israel all of a sudden found out that one of its most formidable enemies, the Houthis, are right there, and they are shooting at Israel at no problem at all. And Israel found itself with no intelligence whatsoever about the Houthis. And now Israel has to find solutions. How do you defeat the Houthis? And you had 2 and something years of war with the Houthis and other fronts, of course. And Israel was almost helpless. Now, after a few months, or a year, Israel started attacking the Houthis in Yemen, which was very impressive operationally, no doubt. Israel also built some kind of, it seems, intelligence base, not base, but database, right, about the Houthis, enough to kill their prime minister and so on. But that didn't really undermine the Houthis' attacks, right? The Houthis kept attacking, and if we ask ourselves the questions, are the Houthis right now stronger or weaker compared to before October 7, 2023? Our answer would be probably they are at least as strong, if not even stronger. Or if we ask ourselves, are the Houthis deterred from attacking Israel in the future? The answer would probably be no. Everybody in Israel realizes that in the next round of war or conflict or whatever it will be around Gaza or anywhere else, the Houthis will probably be there shooting missiles at Israel. And Israel would have almost nothing to do against it, right? So Israel needs to kind of change the way it's treating all this front, all this region. So this is the most important thing. Okay, this is the last 2 years made Israel understood that it needs to be back in the Horn of Africa. Historically, by the way, Israel was there. Israel was very close with Ethiopia when Ethiopia was imperial Ethiopia, right? When it was a relatively strong state. Um, but Israel neglected this region, and now it needs to be back. It needs to have allies near the Houthis. It needs to have territory maybe that they can act and operate from, whether it's intelligence, stopping smuggling routes for the Houthis, maybe intercepting or maybe even striking the Houthi from. So this region is very important. Somaliland is also very important. It's extremely important because it's very close to the Houthis. Now, the other thing is that also Somaliland itself got more hopeful that it can get recognized by at least the Western world, by the pro-Western world, and it started very energetically to pursue recognition and ask for recognition from other states. What made Somaliland very optimistic was two very important things. First, the second election of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States, and the understanding that Somaliland has a lot, or at least some central supporters in the Republican Party, and also the understanding that Trump himself is willing to kind of break taboos. Um, that's one thing. And the other thing is that the Emiratis, the UAE, have become very involved in this region, have become very, very close with the Somalilanders. And because of that, maybe there is more chance here because the Emiratis are also connected to Israel because of the Abraham Accords. There is more chance of kind of joining this kind of axis, Israeli, Emirati, American axis. So the Somalilanders wanted to be in there. The Israelis understood that they need an ally there. They also understood that with Trump in power and the Emiratis there on the ground, it is kind of a good opportunity. It's a possible opportunity to make moves in the Horn of Africa, including bold moves towards Somaliland. And this all came together. The other thing that is really important here is that the Middle East, as we watch almost every hour, there's different news that is like, in different years would be like enough for us to talk about for months, right? Now it's on the daily basis, right? The Middle East now is now being reshaped in a very extreme pace. We see what's going on with Iran. Maybe we're seeing the kind of not a total collapse, right? But we see the decline of the Iranian kind of axis on the one end. It's still there, obviously. The Houthis definitely they're still there, but you see it's kind of decline. On the other end, you see other powers coming up. Some of those powers are better for Israel, like the Emiratis, but others are not, like the Turkish, like the Turks. And what Israel, I think, understood in the last 2 years when all those developments have been happening is that the Middle East is really being reshuffled. All the alliances are being reshuffled. All the situation is reshuffled. And it's a crossroads, right? And now Israel has to decide what to do and needs to be proactive. This is something that Israel, I believe, learned very deeply from October 7. You need to be proactive. You can't let the threats around you just intensify, but you need to actively do things and expand your ability to tackle security problems. So Israel, I think, understands that. Israel, I think, understands that the Middle East is being reshaped, and it wants to be an active participant in the reshaping of the Middle East. And this Somaliland recognition, I think, is one of it. Okay, we see it maybe also in Syria. We see it very strongly in Syria. We see it in other regions as well. But Somaliland is part of it. It's part of the understanding that now we're going to have a new races against countries that maybe were not really bothering us before, like Turkey, or maybe now even the Saudis. So I'm saying this because, and this is something I haven't said before, Somalia, right? Not Somaliland. Somalia has pretty much became in the last few years a satellite state of Turkey. And because of this, Israel also understands that it needs to have its, and because Turkey is kind of, people in Israel kind of realize that Turkey is becoming this maybe, hopefully not, right? But maybe the next main threat on Israel. Israel needs to kind of match with it in a way and or compete with it. So this is also a big part of the stories that we need to remember. All right. All right. So all those things together I think coalesced around our time now and made Israel understand that it should and could take bold moves to safeguard its security. One of them would be recognizing Somaliland, because recognizing Somaliland is going to offer Israel a lot of things. So I'm only going to talk for about a few more minutes. I know we want to leave some time for Q&A. I made two slides here about cons and pros, okay? Because we talked about kind of the pros, right? Maybe, but there are also cons. There are also disadvantages in doing that. And let's talk about the pros first. Israel, we talked about the security element, okay, being close to the Houthis. We talked, I think, enough about this. I can talk more if you have any question. But there are other pros here, other advantages. One of them is economic. Israel and Somaliland together, this is a pro for both countries, can really reach new heights. Somaliland desperately needs help and investments in development. Somaliland is not recognized. So think about a state that is not recognized, how hard it is for corporations, international corporations, to act there, right? International corporation would not really, that not would be the first thing on their priority list to go to a region that is officially part of Somalia, right, a failed state, and not even recognized by the world. Like you don't, it's very hard to get insurance to go to such places. It's very hard to get loans, to borrow money, right, to go and invest there. The fact that Israel recognized Somaliland for Israeli companies and Israeli business people, this is a huge thing because now there might be trade, there might be investment opportunities, and so on. Somaliland wants it. They want it because they don't have any international corporations coming and developing or investing in them. So they have some, obviously, but not enough. They want much more. And Israelis can really step in here and have an edge just because of the simple fact that Israel recognizes Somaliland and no one else is. So that's another kind of pro to this move. This is a leadership role, maybe in the region for Israel. This is kind of the new image of Israel post October 7. It's not the conservative Israel, the status quo Israel. It's the Israel that leading, that is one of the kind of a main power in the Middle East. And it's also, we saw those photos, right? And we all know Israel's image right now in the Western world, especially, right? And social media and so on. This is a very good thing for Israel image, I believe. And if people see it and they see photos like this, right? And then they see a lot of Muslims that saying, we want Israel, we embrace Israel, no problem at all. This is a good thing for Israel's image, something that desperately needed nowadays. So we have those things on the kind of advantage side, but there are also risks. The risks are, I think, for Israel specifically, are not so high, but they are. For example, if you publicly do this such a announcement, you may risk some covert cooperation that you maybe could have done very secretly with Somaliland. Now the Houthis and Al Shabaab and all the bad guys knows that Israel is there and would like to attack Israel. Um, so you trigger terrorists, right? You upset potential allies, the Saudis, the Egyptians. They are not happy about this move, and so on. China is very mad about this move. For Somaliland, there are also cons and pros. Maybe I'll leave it for the Q&A if you specifically want to ask about these things. Um, and the United States is now in dilemma. It's because if we were now under the Biden administration, I don't think that the United States would even consider that. But the Trump administration, we know, does consider recognizing Somaliland. It's not clear at all if they're going to do it or not, but there are very strong voices within the Republican Party, some Democrats also, but it's mostly a Republican thing, calling to recognize Somaliland. Somaliland is a very anti-China kind of entity, very pro-American, anti-Islamist, very reliable, and obviously strategically located. And they are very pro-American. They want to have an American base in the port of Berbera, one of the most strategic spots on Earth. On the other hand, there are also cons that some of them we already covered. I think the most important ones for the Trump administration specifically is the fact that Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey are very against this kind of a move. All right, I think I leave the rest of the things that I wanted to say maybe to the Q&A if we have, because our time, if I'm not mistaken, for me to talk is pretty much over. Right, Alex, are we doing the questions now?
Yes. Great. That sounds like a good place to stop. There are some questions that are starting to come in. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I'll take the prerogative and lead off with some kind of questions, of which I have a few. You made it clear during your presentation that one of the underlying issues in the current contrast between Djibouti, Somaliland, and Somalia in particular is the colonial background. Can we generalize about this a little bit? The colonial heritage of contemporary Libya is also Italian. Um, and the immediate predecessor of you know the southern the southern Yemeni entity, whatever it is currently called, was the Aden Protectorate, which was British, and then you have the trucial states, which are now uh, Kuwait and Oman and UAE and all these things. How much does the colonial heritage matter? How much does the way that Italians in particular and French in particular ran their colonies as opposed to the way the British ran their colonies matter in how contemporary states, successor states, have their acts together or not?
Yeah, that's a great question in general for African history and Middle Eastern history. In Somalia, it's kind of interesting because it's kind of reverse. Okay, African leaders after getting independence decided, as I kind of briefly mentioned, decided that we are gonna keep the borders that the Europeans gave us. That's kind of an absurd. Why would you keep something that colonials did? But the African leaders, the elites in Africa, understood that if they start now opening all this question of how do we redraw borders everywhere in Africa, this is something that would never end and probably would also make them lose their own country and or territories at least, and so on. So African leaders decided to enshrine to respect those borders. Now the Somalis, what they decided in 1960 was the opposite, was to actually erase those colonial borders. Hopefully, this was the aspiration, was to erase those borders and create one great Somalia, a pan-Somali, the pan-Somali idea, right? Like there is a pan-Arab idea and pan-Germanic idea, pan-German. There's also pan-Somali idea that said all the Somalis from Ethiopia, from Djibouti, from Somaliland, Somalia, and Kenya, all should be living together. And for a few days, everybody agreed on this, but literally only for a few days, because they understood it's not a very good setup. And now what's happening now is that the Somaliland, this is kind of a unique case. This is why the Somaliland, legally at least, or in terms of international norms, they have a strong case. Because they say we are actually doing what all the other African countries do. They maintain their colonial borders just like we do. The fact that we are not recognized as independent this is the exception. This is the exception to the rules that we made right after colonialism ended. And it's not fair. All the world is hypocritic against us, right? For not giving us our independence. Although we were a state, a colonial state, but we were a colonial state during colonialism, just like anybody else, just like Kenya was, and so on. And so this is why their case is kind of like historically it's relatively strong. And you ask also, so the borders issue is very important, right? Djibouti, for example, used to be French Somaliland or first French Somalia. They rejected they got independence relatively late, only in the 70s, and they rejected in a referendum the option to join to Somalia because it was already the referendum was late enough to understand that joining Somalia is not a very good idea for your own future. And they are their own independent state, just like Djibouti is an independent state. We also want to be an independent state. That's what Somaliland says. And by the way, Djibouti, ironically again, are one of the biggest critiques against Somaliland independence. They're opposing Somaliland independence, which is also ironic and kind of very unjust, because then they themselves refuse the same things as Somalilanders refuse now to rejoin Somalia. Now, Italians or British and so on, I kind of hinted this. This is a very deep kind of historical, comparative historical situation. What scholars of Somalia tend to claim is that the Italians were more centralized in their rule, in their colonial rule, and therefore they really gave no authority for many decades to the Somalis. So the Somalis did not have their own kind of institutions under Italy, right? They didn't really have a strong institution. They didn't have strong personnel with, appropriate education and so on to run the country when the country got independence. Unlike Somaliland, British Somaliland, that the British didn't really care how they ran. This is a very indirect rule, right? The historians here, the kind of the British famous indirect rule is that they kind of said, we don't really care how you run your business. You run your business as long as our strategic priorities wherever they were in the world are met. Okay, so the British kept in Somaliland the priorities were the maritime, right? The kind of the access to the ocean, and was the fact that the cattle that they needed for their empire, right? And for Aden and so on. So the British said, you can run your own business. So some people say that because the British were kind of more lenient, Somaliland kind of developed a social cohesion and institutions that were more ready, less corrupt maybe, less aggressive than what happened in the Italian side.
I would make only one more observation that post, I mean, there's a sort of parallel going on here with Yemen across the water, which was divided into various colonial entities. North Yemen was part of the Ottoman Empire, South Yemen was British Protectorate, but North Yemen is predominantly Shia. So there is a strong contrast between these two cases. But immediately after independence, um, all these places started fighting each other, and which continues to this day, as of well, certainly throughout the 1960s. The Egyptians were directly involved. It's basically a proxy war between all sorts of powers. And just this week, Saudi Arabia is bombing South Yemen, which is a UAE supported entity. Um, so where there is a direct strategic interests, external powers become directly involved if they see if they see fit. And it seems to me that Israel's diplomatic strategy is much more deft and delicate in this case. Can we say something about this in the context of broader Israeli-African relations, which obviously has a whole history going back to the 1950s and especially the 1960s, but also which was terminated essentially to a large extent after 1973, and now is
Right.
back.
Yeah, in Israel perspective, there is a big connection between recognition of Somaliland and its refocusing of or reshuffling of all its kind of diplomatic priorities. And Africa is very high. Israel has the last year a relatively new foreign minister, right? I think it's been a year. Gideon Sar. Gideon Sar says explicitly at any opportunity that Africa is very high in his priorities. Um, Not only because of the Houthis and the Red Sea, but not only. And he does really, he and others in the government, they do lead really strong at relatively right for Israel's capabilities and attention. Okay,
Pension span.
the attention exactly. There's a lot on the plate, on Israel's plate, but they do see that Israel opened a new embassy in Zambia in August. They are going to open an embassy in Somaliland probably in May. Israeli President Herzog visited the DRC, visited Zambia. Gideon Sar was in Ethiopia twice. So for Israel, yes, it's part of this. For African countries, it's a bit more complex. Some African countries are okay with Israel recognizing Somaliland. Ethiopia is pretty okay with it. It seems like Kenya is really okay, although publicly they're not supporting it, but they're okay with that. But others are not so much because this is the sensitive part, because recognizing what they call the right a breakaway or right a state is that now this is kind of you open a Pandora box, right? And now any secessionist movement everywhere would want to have their own state. So some African countries and some Middle Eastern countries too, right? Like Syria, right? They have big minorities, substantial minorities that are claiming to have independence. And so this is not something that they see so sometimes so lightly. Nigeria, for example, is a very important. Nigeria is an important, obviously important, very important country in Africa, the biggest in Africa, and in terms of population, and it has an okay relations with Israel. Israel has an embassy there. Now, one of the most vocal critiques in Africa, definitely, but in general, is Nigeria of this move of Israeli recognition of Somaliland because they don't want now next, in 5 years from now, Israel or somebody else would recognize Biafra. And the Biafra are also very pro-Israel. There's also a very big history there. And the Biafra secessionist movement that claim to have, independence there. They are really nothing to compare to Somaliland because they don't have a real state on the ground. But still, so they don't like this. So the Nigerians are kind of mad at this. I don't think it will affect relations, right? But it's a move that in Israeli perspective was meant to bolster Israel's African diplomacy, but in African perspective, depends what African, right? But in African perspective, not necessarily is seen as a good thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think now we are still very close to the moment, the historical moment, so it's still pretty high up in the people's emotions. But I think in a year from now, like it will just become, an ordinary thing, and people will move on, and Israel will continue investing in all other parts of Africa. Yeah.
Very good. Let's move on to some questions from the audience, if we can. So Suzanne.
Okay, so we'll answer as many as we can. If not, again, you can email us with your question after this webinar and we can try to get you a response. So we have a question here that says, how do you envision the future of Israel seeking an observer status in the African Union after this decision?
Yes, okay, that's okay. So this actually it's a good question because it's also related to it's related very strongly, I think, to another question that people ask a lot now. How is the normalization of Arabia is going to happen now, right? Because Saudi Arabia is also very mad at Israel. African Union, if people don't know, is also officially mad at Israel. By the way, the chairman person of the African Union is from Djibouti, which is one of the countries that, to begin with, very anti, so they kind of also adopted a very anti-Somaliland approach here. So the answer is this is not a good timing for Israel to join the African Union again, right, as an observer, right? Right. I get it. But to begin with, right, let's see where we were in the historical context. Israel, to begin with, was not about to rejoin the Africa Union. There is a huge criticism by countries. Israel was expelled actually in 2022. And that was before the war in Gaza, right? South Africa, countries like South Africa, Algeria, and many others are pretty anti-Israel, and they wouldn't just embrace Israel, even if like Israel had never recognized Somaliland, right? It's not that like Israel was just about to re-enter the African Union, and now this is gonna spoil it, right? So no, to begin with, Israel's chances were not very high at this right moment, at this specific moment. This is the same answer you can copy and paste and do also Saudi Arabia. Doesn't it hurt Israeli Saudi Arabian normalization prospect? So the answer is yes, definitely. But as we know, as we hear the news from the last few months, that was not around the corner anyways. The Saudis made clear in the last at least 2 3 months to state that they are not going to normalize with Israel, at least not under this government. So not in the next year, right? Which is fine, no problem. It's their own right, but it's not that. It's kind of the AU and Saudi Arabia and all those kind of actors that are really criticizing Israel kind of lost their leverage already by stating to begin with that they are not going to have good relations with Israel. So all their criticism now just seem to be another thing that not really affecting any future developments. But my short answer is, yeah, this is not the best timing for Israel to rejoin the AU because the AU is against recognizing secessionist whatever states, right? And is against those things. And Israel, to begin with, has a lot of powerful opposition at the AU. South Africa is one of the most prominent ones.
True. Okay. So another question we have here is there was talk that Israel wanted to settle Palestinians in Somaliland. Can you please comment on this
Yeah,
issue?
great question. I was interviewed, I think, over 15 or 20 times in the last week from Spain, from United States. They all ask this question. I think that this thing is not on the table at all. I don't think it was in discussions or in negotiations, at least in the last few months. And I'll explain why. First, Somaliland is very important to Israel. Without Gaza, without the Palestinians, because of the reasons that I said. Second of all, like the idea of bringing Gazans there, it's actually counterproductive to why Israel really needs Somaliland, which is a kind of a foothold in the Red Sea close to the Houthis. And the most important thing actually is that all the idea of dislocating, relocating, whatever, migrating Gazans is not realistic, and it's not realistic right now, and it's contradicting the Trump peace plan, the 20 points of the Trump plan that said specifically and explicitly that Palestinians are not going to be relocated from Gaza. Okay, so this is not gonna fly, right? This is not a thing. To add all this, I'll tell you that Somaliland said no. Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli foreign minister, just also denied it. So I can say, I don't know for certain, right, what was behind closed doors, but my very strong intuition and sense of understanding the situation is that this thing is not even it's off the table completely.
Okay. It's good to hear. Okay, so another question we have here is these are big ones, but how do you think Israel's recognition of Somaliland affects the geopolitical situation of the Middle East and the Horn of Africa? And then, with the influence of Israel, which countries do you think will follow Israel to recognize Somaliland?
All right. So that's a good question. Geopolitical position and stuff like that. I mean, it gives you. I think it's going to be a very strong alliance between Somaliland and Israel. now. I think I see it happening. We also see, and that's connected to the other part, that not so many countries are rushing to recognize Somaliland right now. I think everybody's waiting for Donald J. Trump to make the decision, and I don't think he'll make the decision. Again, my guess, right? My kind of feeling that it's not a decision that's going to come soon. But maybe I should not kind of estimate what the White House will do right now, right? But it might happen like an hour from now. But my feeling is that it's not something that is around the corner, and therefore many other countries will not follow Israel. So I have a feeling that for some time now, we'll have only Israel recognizing Somaliland. Again, I don't want to predict. I don't have a crystal ball, right? But there is a big chance. There is a big chance that it will be only Israel for a while. Now, there might be some smaller countries in here and there that are very close to kind of the Israeli/American state of mind right now that might do it. Some people even said like, countries in the Pacific like Micronesia and Samoa, those countries that always vote for Israel at the UN. I wouldn't be super surprised if Argentina all of a sudden will do that. I don't know. Um, I don't think the Emirates are going to do it soon. The Emirates, I don't think they should because they got in big trouble with the Saudis right now. They should kind of calm down on those things. And I think they understand that. So I don't think the Emiratis are going to do that soon. Again, they're not against it. They're just not going to do it officially, right? I don't think the Ethiopians will do it. The Chinese, China just flew in a delegation, a high delegation, senior delegation to Ethiopia, and they signed big agreements, and Ethiopia announced that they don't recognize Taiwan. They didn't say anything about Somaliland, but it's Taiwan. I don't see Ethiopia now just like recognizing Somaliland, pissing off China, and do all this stuff about it, because Somaliland in Chinese mind, Somaliland and Taiwan are kind of interconnected, right? Um, so I don't see Ethiopia is a big supporter of Somaliland, big ally, but it's not going to officially recognize it now again. It's still a bold move. What Israel did is a bold move to be the first one. To be the first country after Israel to do it is even a bolder move, I think, because you're not only recognizing Somaliland from scratch, you're recognizing Somaliland after Israel. In a way, this kind of a recognition that you are very close with Israel, okay? And many countries wouldn't want to have it so out in the open, okay? Maybe Argentina or Micronesia wouldn't care so much, but I don't see like Morocco or the UAE or Ethiopia or even Kenya doing it. Maybe some small country in there, I don't think. But there might be a big chance that it's only going to be Israel for a while, which is for Israel necessarily not the worst thing. I mean, Somaliland would like to have a lot of countries, but Israel, again, Israeli interests are not that everybody necessarily recognizes Somaliland. I mean, it's a nice to have, and they're not against it. But Israel wants to have a bilateral, very strong relations with Somaliland, a very intimate alliance with Somaliland. So for Israeli interests, it doesn't really matter.
Um, Terrific. And that's actually a pretty good place to stop. I have other questions about the global repercussions and about the future of redrawing colonial era borders in the Middle East and Africa, but that would take at least another hour, I think.
Definitely.
So let me thank you for coming on quite short notice and giving us a very nice overview of the background and the issues at stake and some thoughts about the future. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating and listening in here. Please be on the lookout for future webinars. We are rapidly trying to put together all sorts of additional webinars on different subjects, and again on fairly short notice. So please watch your emails. So thanks again to Dr. Lubotzky and for everybody for being here. And everyone should have a good weekend, and we'll see you all quite soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thanks. So long.